So let's go ahead and get started. I see a number of people have logged on and more people are logging on every second, it looks like. Uh, but before we get to Matt Berg and his presentation, uh, I've got a little intro. And let me just start off by saying that this is our inaugural Texas Water Journal webinar. And with that comes all sorts of working out the kinks in the system as we go along. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Zoom or have had to become familiar with Zoom over the last few weeks, like I have, but it's not always as intuitive to operate as you might like. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Todd Bottler. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Texas Water Journal. And let's start the presentation now. So hopefully you've had a chance to see the Water Journal at some point. The journal is a peer-reviewed journal published by the Texas Water Journal, which is a 501c3 board, and the Texas Water Resources Institute at Texas A&M. We publish articles as they're ready instead of waiting until complete issues are ready. And we're able to do that because it's a fully online journal. And of course, the journal is free. You can Google Texas Water Journal or go to texaswaterjournal.org to find it. Here are the folks that bring you the Water Journal. There's a whole team of people, really too many to go through, but if you are interested in seeing who does what for the Water Journal, just go to texaswaterjournal.org and look under Texas Water Journal people. So the journal accepts 4 different types of articles: general research or issue articles, book reviews, commentaries, research policy program, or legal reviews. The word length, these are just some general guidelines because the journal is a digital journal. We don't hold people to these numbers, and we're quite flexible about that. The article that you're going to be hearing about today is actually one of our reviews, or a policy review. So there's some other things that the Water Journal does. One of the things that has done in the past is something called the Texas Water Journal Forum, which is a series of panel discussions about various Texas water issues, which we videotape in front of a live audience and then post on the TWJ website. Last one of these was at Texas State University on the history of the Edwards-Ocker dispute. And we hope to start this series up again once it's safe for everybody to get together in large numbers. Another thing that the journal is involved with is Texas Plus Water, which we produce with the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University and the Texas Water Resources Institute at A&M. And we just have a new issue that came out of this monthly publication, which is also free. Occasionally we produce special products like this issue of Water Resources Impact for the American Water Resources Association, which we published last summer, and it was about various Texas water issues. More recently, we have started working with the Hill Country Alliance and Texas Public Radio on some of the Texas water symposiums. Unfortunately, this one was canceled because of the pandemic, but we're hoping to be able to reschedule that sometime in the future. And now webinars. So our webinars are based on our recent articles. And this first one is going to be by Matthew Berg, based on his article, State Legislatures, Voters Move to 86 Texas's Flooding Challenges. Another ready for May 13th at 10 a.m. And that's going to be Gabe Collins and his article, Oilfield Water Infrastructure Connectivity, the case for a hydrovascular network in the Permian Basin. And so Gabriel will talk about that and water markets out in the Permian Basin. And that webinar will have a fee associated with it, a small fee, which goes to support the journal, which is a 501c3, and to pay for things like Zoom. So let me tell you about our speaker today. Dr. Matthew Berg is the CEO and principal scientist of Sinfero Consultants, a water resources risk management organization based in Houston. He has nearly 20 years of experience in a variety of water resources issues across business and academic sectors. His research was cited in the first ever state flood assessment for the Texas legislature. Dr. Berg also authored the first watershed plan from Texas approved by the EPA and helped develop the Texas Watershed Steward training program used by Texas AgriLife Extension and projects across the state. So, Matt, I'm going to try to turn this over to you now.
All right, Todd, I'm ready to go whenever you're ready to let me share. Here we go. All right, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here this morning. The view from where I'm sitting is impeccable. My living room looks fantastic this morning. And in the interest of it, let's say of honesty, because it is National Honesty Day, which it actually is, we decided to go with videos of our faces off for this because it's also National Hairstyle Day. And I may or may not be wearing the same hairstyle that I have been for exactly the last 2 months, except getting slightly progressively longer every single day. So I want you to be able to focus on the slides as they are. I also think Zoom is a very ironic name, given the pace of how stay at home feels like it's unfolding. But we don't really have the luxury of stopping preparation for what comes next, because two consistent things throughout all of human civilization are pandemics, but also floods. So looking forward to how this state might be able to show some other states how to grapple with some of those issues moving forward. So we're going to give an overview of some of the stuff that happened in the 2019 legislative session, but wrap a lot of high-level perspectives around that as well. So the clear first place to start, a lot of people understand Texas wrestling with flooding really has a peak around Hurricane Harvey. It's forced the National Weather Service to use a brand new color on some of the rainfall accumulation maps after that event. But even that didn't do its service. If you know anything about where rainfall did hit its peak, around the Nederland area over by Sabine Lake, it actually hit a little bit over 60 inches. This color scheme also actually would go on to be used in Hurricane Florence on the East Coast as well. So some very, very severe events. But as we in Texas who deal with flooding on a regular basis know, that by no means was the only causal factor for the legislature to deal with flooding. If we look just the year before, the state in a lot of different areas wrestled with all types of flooding, from the coast to East Texas to Central Texas. Lots of storms. If we go back a year earlier to 2015, we all are very familiar with the tragedy that unfolded in Wimberley. Similar event hammered Austin. Same storm also swamped Houston. Later in the year, had some issues around Corsicana and Brownsville as well. So this is by no means a Hurricane Harvey driven response. It's a legacy of flooding that we continue to deal with to this day. A little bit after that, Texas Water Journal also published an article looking at, well, if Hurricane Harvey receives focus, what's the underlying story? Is this just an act of God that we can write off in terms of response and how we think about flooding? Well, if you subtract all of Hurricane Harvey's impacts, the high river levels, the torrential downpours, there's still an unfolding trend of streams across the state in many areas increasing. And in some places, That's true even where large dams have been put in. So as we think about how to deal with flooding, can't just focus on one event, but it's a longer story told over, in many cases, multiple decades. And even the places where we've pulled big levers to do something major about it, it still keeps increasing in terms of the amount of water flowing downstreams. So that kind of folds into the mix as well. Another thing that hit in 2018, it's very important to receive a lot of attention, is NOAA's Atlas 14, which is basically a reanalysis of what we could expect in terms of torrential downpours across the state. Now, this folded in some new data. Some of it looked at trends, and a lot of places were previously using data from 1961 analysis. Some places had looked at that a lot more recently. But overall, there were some very interesting trends across the state. Now, this is important because a lot of the engineering that we do for all of our infrastructure, the way that we build communities, the way that we build roads, and almost everything else depends on statistically what we could reasonably expect to be what you could put quotes around as a worst case scenario that we would rationally be expected to defend against. And that's usually a 1% rainfall storm. Well, if that changes what we would expect statistically, then the way that we do all of these things also needs to change. Based on the data that was reanalyzed, some places out in West Texas experienced both extremes. So based on comparison with the previous data that were used, up in the Guadalupe Mountains, we saw dramatic increases. Some of that was due to nuance of peaks and valleys. Down the Big Bend, significant drying of what our expectations are. But then you've got this big band of new analysis and estimates far damper than what had previously been used. Pocket over on the Rio Grande Valley stretching all the way over towards East Texas and the Louisiana border. And a lot of people refer to this as the 100-year rainfall, and as we all know far too well, that by no means, if you get it once a century, you're good until the next one. It's only a statistical analysis that means that you have in any given year a 1% chance of experiencing that. So you could have one in back-to-back years, you could have multiples in the same year. Well, another thing that was on the radar leading up to the legislative session was Texas flexed its muscles and took the lead nationally in terms of the number of floods that were declared federal disasters. Second place is California, and we've got them beat by a couple. You look at the map of where floods have happened, but then you also see the list that hurricanes are there, coastal storms are there. So putting floods in boxes or silos by themselves doesn't mean that floods haven't hit other places through these other types of disasters. You say, well, look up there, there's a huge gap in West Texas and the Panhandle. Well, in the interest of really addressing all of the state's areas and citizens, I submit this picture. This one looks like a terrible flood, probably somewhere down on the coast or East Texas. Well, if you know anything about this particular one, that's Lubbock. Nowhere is immune from flooding in Texas. And this one was actually a sub 3-inch storm in 2016. Some parts of the area got about 2.5. The bulk of the storm was about 3 inches south and west of town. So anywhere, if you get intense downpours, can lead to flooding. And if you look at historical flood impacts from the NOAA storm events database, everywhere in Texas shows up on that list. And the graph down at the bottom shows throughout the last couple of decades in Texas, the number of flood events is tremendously huge. Everywhere on that list, or every county on that map has experience with flooding, from Hardeman County, just on the southeast corner of the Panhandle, down to Berg County, which has over 300 events. And you can see, similarly, what's known as Flash Flood Alley, kind of the southern and eastern portions of the Edwards Plateau. Definitely some big experience with flooding there, also in the north central Texas area, and then down around Galveston Bay. So there is no part of Texas that gets away clean in terms of dealing with flooding. The hits keep coming. So leading up to the legislature, one of the best things to provide in terms of rolling out bills is information. providing a needs assessment, and that's exactly what the state flood assessment did. Now, some legislators pointed this as being the be-all, end-all of telling what projects needed to be done, providing the framing around those, and then yielding a plan that would be turned loose to fix all of the problems. Well, that wasn't quite realistic. That would take a big, heavy lift. So instead, this provided ideas, kind of pointed to some different needs. And the big takeaways from this one were, it was really an assessment of risks, of an overview of kind of the roles and responsibilities of different players in the space across the state and regionally. Really an estimate of maybe what all the costs could be, and then kind of stakeholder views, people that participated in the process of what flood planning should look like. There were a couple of takeaways from it, but really two of the big ones were the need for risk mapping and modeling. You can't manage what you don't know, so that's very important. And then also emphasis on collaborative flood planning. So playing together, making sure that all interests are represented and that some flood project doesn't necessarily harm an adjacent or nearby area. So all those things are very important. And the very big cherry on top was leading up to the very start of the legislative session. Of all the July through December periods on record, and there's 125 of those, this map shows how wet in terms of a ranking that period was in July to December 2018. So of 125 years of record, if you see a dark blue on that map, that means that it was the very wettest July through December period. There's a couple of states on there. One of those is Texas. If you see kind of the lighter turquoise that's just below the darkest, that means they had a top 10 rainfall accumulation year for that period. We zoom in on Texas itself, a lot of the state had its wettest July through December ever. And if you didn't have the wettest, it was really close to that. Nobody was below average. It was very, very rainy. So if the message wasn't driven home by all of the other confluences of storm events, of information coming out, this really provided the highlight necessary to kick off the session. And it didn't take long for that to really reveal itself. There were bills filed from day one, ready to go towards flooding. If you did kind of a scanning throughout history of the number of bills that were introduced, so not necessarily became law, but those introduced that have the word flood or flooding in them, far and away, the 86th legislature ruled the roost. Far more bills related to flooding than any other session in the past. Interestingly, if you look how that tracks with climate trends over time, was it a rainy year, was it a wet year, there's a little bit of relationship. So you respond to the close-in, most painful need, and that was clearly flooding. In the past, there have been also some very wet periods, and those were sometimes followed by rather productive years or in terms of introduced flood bills. But the same can also be true for drought. So legislators see their constituent needs and respond towards those. So this was very much a flood session. Well, if you look at where those bills were coming from and kind of expand the net that you're going to cast in terms of what a flood bill is. So everything that would include wording on drainage or storms, really kind of rolling out what could reasonably be seen as relating to flooding. This is where they're from. So those black bars means that those didn't get passed. In a lot of places, big numbers were kind of revolved around bills that a lot of people introduced, hoping to meet a need, say communicating a flood risk towards home buying in real estate transactions, or around property tax valuation exemptions after a storm. There was a lot of action in both of those areas. Just because there's a big number doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely independent of one another. But in this map, you do see some hot spots of where those numbers were from. There were also a couple of propositions that were passed later in the year. We'll talk about one of those. So a couple of those needed some voter action, continued later on. And then a couple were vetoed by Governor Abbott. So there's distribution across the state, but clearly some hotspots of where those bills were originated. So revisiting the state flood assessment, had some ideas, some risks, but the very biggest thing that came out of that process was funding. Funding is the biggest question because these projects take money. A lot of times they're big, they're thoughtful, they're comprehensive, they take a lot of study, they take a lot of construction, or they take a lot of work by different people in different areas that do different things. Funding is a critical need. So one of the biggest ones that worked towards that goal was providing funding, and in the form of both Senate Bill 7 and then the Appropriations Bill, which is Senate Bill 500. This established the Flood Infrastructure Fund that has been talked about across the state. We'll dive into a little bit here. We're not going to go all the way into the weeds, which we very much could, but just giving kind of an overview of how this process came to be. Now, a lot of people bang the drum of it's called the Rainy Day Fund. This is the perfect time to use it. It took a little bit for that process to actually play out. But eventually, from the Economic Stabilization Fund, just under $800 million was rolled over to the Flood Infrastructure Fund. And that, through grants and low-cost loans, can go to subdivisions. That could be cities, counties, a couple other special districts that are set up through the state to do projects related to flooding. But another part of that, which is also important, is about $850 million from the same Rainy Day Fund, but that was going to go towards local match that was required for federal projects that were ongoing through different disaster recovery programs. So if there's a, say, FEMA program or an Army Corps of Engineers program, some of those monies could be used to provide local, what it could be seen as skin in the game to make projects happen comprehensively. One of the other big things is data is absolutely critical. So you can't respond to a need unless you really understand what that need is. So this provided a little bit of money to do some additional needs assessment, provide some answers for steps going forward. Now, to be eligible for that, you had to be a flood project. And that was defined very broadly. For flood mitigation, drainage, anything to protect, mitigate, or reduce risk, ultimately. And that could be essentially any step in that process, from planning to getting approval to actually doing those things. And it's not just the traditional big structural approaches, but also non-structure and also nature-based features, which could be very important. And also potentially to do some dredging on coastal ports and ship channels that have been impacted by flooding. So the Texas Water Development Board has even said, if it sounds flood related, go ahead and pitch it. So big opportunities for lots of different kinds of ideas to be advanced here. One of the things that can also be met with some of that data collection is providing localized usable information in terms of how rivers work, where risks are. Things like base level engineering, which can show how usable hazard maps are, and it can be also used to create what's called base flood elevation to show if an area is flooded, how deep are the flood waters going to be. That can be really used to communicate some flood risk or hazard potential in different areas. And that information doesn't exist in a lot of this state and a lot of other states. So there's a big need to develop that information. If you look at what a lot of people call FEMA maps, flood hazard maps, flood insurance rate maps, which I'll point out are really just for flood insurance purposes. They don't necessarily tell you how real a risk that you have in that area. There's nothing magical about a line on a map that says if you cross it, you're safe. But if you go the other way, then you're at risk of floods. But that's an important tool that's used across the country. You can see in this state, there's a lot of places where that information needs to be performed and generated. But even where it does exist, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's up to date or relevant. As soon as you produce these maps that same day, they start to become obsolete. So making sure that we have up-to-date risk assessment and hazard mapping is one of the very big needs that can be addressed by some of this in the early steps. Importantly, one of the joint resolutions of House Joint Resolution number 4, introduced by Representative Dave Phelan, turned into an opportunity for Texas voters back in November of last year to move that dedicated funding outside of what's called the general revenue fund. So it's kind of its own little siloed piggy bank. It can't be pulled back and reallocated to different sources. So it's its own little entity. That's important. And we'll come back to that in a second. The other big one that received a lot of attention was Senate Bill 8. And this revolves around state flood planning. One of the things that came out of that state flood assessment was the need to do things collaboratively and cooperatively, and ideally from a regional or locally driven basis. They have much more familiarity with what's possible, what the needs are, the closer to home you get. So making that a stakeholder-driven process was very much emphasized. And those groups, when they're put together in their regions, would look at both strategies, but also specific projects to deal with flooding challenges. One of the other charges was also to look at what's already there in 100 and 500-year floodplains, and then make some decisions, projections about how that might play out going forward. One of the other things is identifying needs or opportunities at both the local and the state level in terms of what regulations are in place, what levers could we pull, what kind of fine tuning might be possible to really maximize, potentially at zero cost, our protection from flooding. So just the way we think about things, enforce things, and require different things in how counties, cities, different jurisdictions operate. And when all of these are put together in their individual regions, they'll be rolled up into one single state flood plan. Again, this one had another important element that's often kind of pushed to the sides, but it's very important. It dedicated $150 million to the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board, which has responsibilities in the slightly more rural portions of the state, but they oversee maintenance of big numbers of flood control structures that were constructed by federal programs, in many cases 80 years ago. And they could be just little flood control dams downstream of a neighborhood seen as an old farm pond, but those play a very critical role on almost all of our major major river basins. So maintaining these, knowing what the integrity of those is absolutely critical because they're in very important places and play an important role. So those will be looked at with the maintenance plan updated every decade. Also some coordination with the Texas Water Development Board and the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So we go back to that state flood assessment with many people were hoping would be and pointed to as becoming the plan that would fix everything. Well, it's going to graduate. Hopefully we'll end up with no longer assessment, but a real plan in 2024. But first, those local groups, those regional groups have to get to work. And one of the things that's a pretty good model for this process as it rolls out is the water planning process. So both making sure we have enough clean water for the future. Maybe it makes sense to kind of model that when we think about how to deal with when we have too much water. And there's probably some cross linkages through that. So understanding that the Texas Water Development Board is responsible for the former, it just makes sense to have the latter continue to rely on that expertise and build it even further. And that's what's going to happen. So as it rolls out, Texas Water Development Board is going and already has significantly built up its flood-related staff. I think a fantastic decision was made to build in a lot of flexibility and not over-prescribe approaches, but to give room to kind of wiggle, figure things out, and then revisit as necessary in implementation of both Senate Bill 7 and Senate Bill 8. And one example of that is in the guidelines for flood project funding, not writing that into a rule, which is a lot harder to fix if necessary, kind of revisiting that every year. Can maybe make some fine-tuning adjustments based on how things have played out previously. Similar thing with the flood planning process is after one iteration, kind of huddling up within groups and between groups and identifying how can we make this even better, who has it really figured out, what maybe some things that we can pass around as best practices. Another exciting outflow of this is understanding even between agencies themselves, just like at the federal level, at the state level, both water as a responsibility, but also even specifically flooding as a responsibility can be fractured across multiple agencies, and making sure that there is coordination really can help streamline some experiences. And one important outcome of this is to create a single form for flood project applications. So say it doesn't best fit, or there's depleted funds in the Senate Bill 7 programs, maybe there's another state agency that can help you out too. So introducing that coordination really is an exciting development. Now, to be one of those funded flood projects through the Flood Infrastructure Fund, it makes sense that you've got to show that you've thought through what it's going to cost and what the benefits are going to be, and that net returns positive. There's different ways to think about how to do that. And again, that's one of those things that can provide some wiggle room this first go around to figure out what works best. But then you also not just focus on the upfront capital cost. If you build a large structural project, then that's going to require maintenance to maintain its integrity for the long term. We're talking in some cases many decades. So at least putting an idea that that's going to have a dollar sign attached to it, how we're going to actually achieve that funding stream is an important thing to think through before you solve a project with a big structural approach. And obviously, if you've already funded something, you don't get to double dip and fund it again with a different stream of dollars. But importantly, any project has to really be run through, or at least have a representative at the table from other neighboring jurisdictions. That's very important, because as you can imagine, in some places there might be a perverse incentive for an upstream interest to say, well, it's easy to get rid of floods, just push them downstream. And that's not going to create a very good playground for people to come together. So making sure that all interests have wrestled with these and can come to some sort of agreement. Also, it makes sense if you're going to receive some assistance to put a project on the ground to meet a minimum standard. So if you are already doing best practice and you need some additional help, that makes sense. In some places where those standards aren't in place, that's an easy and logical next step, first fix to make that happen. And one of the other charges that came out of the legislation in 2019 was to require all flood projects to look at the potential for storing floodwater on the water supply side. So that's kind of that cross-linkage between the water planning process and the flood planning process. There's some ideas of projects out there that may happen. It might be kind of tricky, but I look forward personally to seeing some of the creative ideas that pop up and wrestling with what might be feasible and what that would look like. For this year, again, every year there's going to be an intended use plan that talks about what kind of funds are available, how they'll be prioritized for that funding cycle. Now, this is the very first time this has happened. For 2020, this funding cycle and the bridge projects, or their bridge applications, so kind of the short, quick applications are due in June. It's a mix of 0% interest loans and grants up to 100%. It's really gonna be hard to get to 100% grant. Pretty much all of them require skin in the game, except for a couple of cases where the median household income is very low, less than half of the state average, and there's been a recent flood disaster declaration. But overall, the amount of grants versus loans for each project kind of depends on what kind of project you're doing, what the local need is in terms of income or unemployment, or is the population trending downward, and is it outside an urban area. One of the other things that also gets points and gets potential grant dollars is the use of nature-based features, which is interesting to me. And again, if you've actually experienced that flooding disaster on a relatively recent timescale, your need is clear and you get a little bit of extra emphasis there. Similarly, prioritizing projects once they've come in, separate from what kind of funding is available for any project. The way that they're going to rank these out is on similar factors, but also in terms of Does it benefit those people that are nearby? It's required to have everybody cooperate, but does it benefit more than just the project applicant? Can the project be done quickly? Will it yield extra water for the water planning process? How many structures are pulled out of a floodplain? And at the end, once all those are prioritized, if there happens to be a tie, that's going to be kicked down to what's called the Social Vulnerability Index. And what that essentially is it's a measure of a community's ability to bounce back from a disaster. It's things like poverty, transportation, housing, and then kind of some language and social factors as well. So the way that projects are going to be identified, especially after this first cycle, what's going to happen, which is going to happen before regional flood planning is in place, that first slug of projects is going to have to be done cooperatively, collaboratively. Once the first state flood plan is produced, all of those projects can then become eligible for flood infrastructure fund funding. But you can only be eligible for that funding if you go through the state flood planning process. And the way that that's going to be done is similar again to the water planning process. So here are our water planning regions. If we look at flood planning regions, it's much more aligned with river basins, which makes sense. Water flows downhill. There are a couple of separations among some of our longest river basins. And I suppose the one up on the Red River was done to provide equal access to the world's largest casino up in southern Oklahoma. We'll see. Thinking through all the allocations and planning processes, funds, I'll say the big elephant in the water, what's the funding story? It's going to be very interesting going forward. The news coming out of every local entity, municipality, jurisdiction is not shiny in this state. You got pretty much every metropolitan area and beyond talking about really hurting in terms of their budgets, big time. So even if we have a 0% loan, what's the appetite for that going to be? I look forward to seeing that. Say we do end up using a lot of grants. Use the entirety of that money up with a little LOCA match that goes along with it. Will the state kick some back in? That's interesting. Remember, we talked about the flood infrastructure fund being created outside of the general revenue fund. Now it can't be clawed back, so that money is safe, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will be replaced. And some of the other supporting funds, there are question marks around that. So what will the appetite be in this next state session around allocating more towards flooding? Stepping back a little bit more, what's the possibility for help from the federal side? Regardless of what the administration looks like maybe later on this year, there's obviously lots of money flowing, but that can't happen indefinitely. There's been some ideas around maybe using infrastructure as a big possibility for economic stimulus. Could some of that go towards flood infrastructure? Maybe. But again, it can't be forever. But one of the complicating pieces in that is, remember we talked early on about the number of flood and drought bills kind of cycling with how rainy or dry it had been? There's some indication that what we're seeing across, especially middle western parts of the state, all the way towards southwestern United States and the Pacific coast, is the trends are kind of lining up towards some of the very driest times in history. And I'm not talking human history, recorded history. I'm talking about tree ring history, sediment analysis history for centuries. It's really hard to convince people, especially in hard economic times, to devote funding towards flooding when drought is really rearing its head. So this is really becoming murky. But I've got an easy answer. If somebody were to ask me what the future looks like, it's a very simple answer. It's very unclear. I don't know. These are some big, big questions. It's exciting time. There's new programs starting, but there's a lot that still has to be teased out. not just among the details of implementing the projects, but how it will work, and when the end of that funding cycle happens, what next? So there's some very big conversations to happen across the state. If you ask me, in terms of the road ahead, I think we've got to think really big of what best available science means, which is one of the guidance principles in these flood programs. Obviously, a lot of the traditional engineering approaches, absolutely critical, using the most timely data. But I think there's a huge opportunity to think even broader than that. A lot of times, in many river basins across the state, they're much more well studied than people realize, especially if you consider what academic institutions do. I think there's a big opportunity to build on that groundwork that's already been done, and that should very much be examined. So not just traditional engineering studies, but true science of understanding the processes that make rivers move water, move sediment, and other issues to really make sure we're meeting the best needs possible. I think because of the funding crunch, making sure that all jurisdictions use money wisely and use the cheapest approaches that also meet needs is going to be huge. So an emphasis that I very much appreciate in non-structural strategies, that's very critical. I think it's only going to increase. Are there ways that we can keep people safe, keep property safe without having to build things? Because we've seen a lot of places, even when you do build things, that doesn't necessarily fix a need. And in some places, it actually becomes a liability itself. So how can we, even if we're doing structural things, wrap it up in non-structural strategies as well? What can we do in-house and on paper sometimes, policy-wise, regulation-wise, to accomplish those same goals, keeping people and property safe? And going forward, given the funding approaches and really atmosphere of today, can we continue to rely on federal recovery funds? That's kind of been everybody's game plan in the entire country to this point. We have a flood, well, the federal government will come and help us out. The National Flood Insurance Program is in terrible condition. It's in huge, huge red territory. Continue to rely on that is probably not feasible. So how can we rethink what we're going to do going forward? A couple of last ideas. Revisiting this Atlas 14 is interesting to me. See where the changes happened. See where bills came from that session. Stack those on top of each other. There's an interesting trend there. Elected officials responded to felt needs in places where the estimates were are becoming higher than we had previously used. So we've got to talk about the climate story. It's got to be at the table. What are our projections going forward? Even Atlas 14 itself was only good up until that point in time, and they had to drag it out to include Harvey. Well, we've had Imelda happen since then. We've had some other torrential downpours, and that's just until now. What about looking forward? Infrastructure projects have big, long lives. Let's work with that. There's a very important recent study out from the Office of the State Climatologist at Texas A&M University, looking at what the water trends and other trends across the state could be. And it paints a picture of a big roller coaster. Dries get drier, wets get wetter. And we have to deal with both of those at the same time in many places. That's got to be part of the conversation as well. Say, let's look at Houston hobby. Well, the frequency of days with at least 6 inches of rainfall has really increased. It didn't used to be a thing. Now it's more so becoming a thing. Well, you can say, yeah, Hurricane Harvey pushed that spike up, which it did. But then there's also the top 2 rainiest days in that airport's history. And there's kind of an interesting stair step up from history until now. We can say, okay, that's probably biased from a couple different places. Well, if you look at if it rains on a certain day, how likely is it to be a pretty heavy rain? And that is about doubled over the last many decades. So when it rains, it's getting rainier. We've got to think about these things in a very big, high-level way. I think one of the things that is very exciting in terms of this legislation was the focus on nature-based solutions. I think there's a very big approach here. I really like this source. It's called Naturally Resilient Communities. You can say, well, you know, that's using nature, that doesn't really make sense. Let's do the traditional projects. But I really encourage you to look closely at who's endorsing this. That's the American Planning Association, American Society of Civil Engineers, American Society of State Floodplain Managers, American Association of Counties, and more. So the people that have a lot at stake and think hard about these things are very much all in on this one. I love it because it kind of sets out a menu of what are our challenges, what are our, maybe some options to address these specific local needs in terms of even how much money do we want to spend. So I think it's a very, very thoughtful approach in terms of walking through how we can creatively deal with challenges. Kind of a fun little playbook, and then jumps into some case studies on what might be possible. I think this is very interesting. Very critically, actually this yesterday was a yesterday. So this is just this week. A lot of the floods in the Mississippi River and Missouri River basins in the central part of this country really forced people to think differently. There's a lot of levees, there's a lot of dams and locks, and there was still flooding. And rain is projected to be heavier into the future. So not doing the same things the same ways has really been on people's minds. And just this year, already people are starting to think a little bit differently of how we expect to live alongside water and what that relationship should look like. So in closing, I think a couple of high-level ideas to really drive home, really to make sure that we're keeping costs low, but actually meeting people's needs, protecting property, protecting life. We have to address causes, not the symptoms. If you've got a broken leg, just taking a shot of morphine isn't going to make you better. It'll make you feel better, but you might actually do more damage. Similarly, addressing flooding from a prevention standpoint and not treatment. If you've got that broken leg, it would be a lot easier if you never had it in the first place. So let's think that way about flooding. Let's work with natural processes, not against them. Nature will always only work towards an equilibrium. If we get between natural processes and an equilibrium, that's kind of the definition of a money pit. So how can we work smarter? Lastly, this is going to take a ton of engagement from all voices and making sure that we have equal and equitable representation from all interests. So everybody has a seat at the table. Use your voice and encourage those and lift those up that don't have one right now. And because today is also Thankful Thursday, I appreciate you listening. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me?
I can.
So we'll take you questions. I don't know if all the participants have seen that, but if you want, we got one question. You can start registering additional questions if you like. I got a few questions, and since I'm the moderator, I guess I get to ask my questions first, I guess. So I'm going to ask you about a statement having to do with some research to see what you think about it. You ready?
Shoot, Todd.
Okay, recent research by the National Bureau of Economic Research indicates that markets fail to incorporate risks from flooding and climate-related catastrophes. They found that losses from extreme weather events are rising, a function mostly of people and more wealth becoming more concentrated in areas where they're most vulnerable. And so if home prices accurately reflected risk, the researchers say they'd be most likely, there'd be less development in floodplains. And they estimate that properties in floodplains across the United States are overvalued by about $34 billion. What do you think about that?
So I've taken enough economics courses to be just dangerous enough to answer this one. Ultimately, I think it is a question of market efficiency. When you're dealing with negotiations, one of the issues that always comes up is distribution of information. Who knows more than the other party in terms of coming to an agreement? And if you don't know what flood risk is, or especially if you don't communicate that, then that's very disparate or unequal information. And in the realm of economics, that basically means it's called what's an externality. It's not priced in. So somebody's not making an information that's based on the correct valuation. And that becomes really messy. Some people don't have the means to afford a single mistake. On the other side, some people have the means to continue to make that mistake over and over again, especially when some programs are set up to kind of subsidize that mistake. So knowing what that real risk is and then absolutely communicating that would change things. And I personally, as a taxpayer, both at the state, local, state, and federal levels, want to make sure that when I'm paying my taxes, one, it goes towards keeping people and property out of harm's way. Maybe it challenges those perverse incentives from making bad decisions, but what also might be possible in terms of how we interact with floods, period, that it could be an opportunity for a big change in quality of life for everybody, not just kind of a bailout for those people that maybe already could have afforded it. So these are very big and high level questions, very philosophical, but I do think understanding and communicating real risk, pricing it in, has to happen for that market to be efficient.
All right. So here's some more research I'm interested in your opinion about. And this research suggests that FEMA flood maps vastly underestimate the flood risk. And this one study estimates that 41 million US residents that live along the nation's rivers are at risk of flooding, which is about 2.6 to 3.1 times higher than the amount determined based on the regulatory flood maps produced by FEMA. What do you think about that?
That's a problem. I've actually seen similar research as well. I'll go ahead. I think I've still got, can't remember if I've got control. One of the maps that I showed was the age of what you would call a FEMA map. And again, remember the second that those are released, they start to become obsolete. So one of the big problems with using maps is, in some cases, I don't know if you noticed the tail end, maps in some part of the countries are over 30 or even 40 years old. So we're talking the original maps, we're still working from those. And the landscape around those is very different. If you add on top also maybe changing rainfall patterns, that's a compounding factor. But then we also have new modeling capabilities that's a lot finer grained and higher resolution, both in terms of time and in space. So we're not really leveraging what we could be doing to understand how these systems work. I've seen really a lot of the biggest problems. Generally, we understand the biggest rivers the best because they have the biggest potential to mess things up. But the smaller streams, especially those with maybe a big flash flood potential, are a lot harder to wrestle with. So that's where some of the weaknesses are. That's one of the biggest, I think, opportunities to address it. But I very much agree. And again, these are always backward looking. If we talk in terms of future, there's a lot that can change. And if we're building infrastructure at the front end for something that might be a very different system, 50, 60, like we talked about, some dams are 80 years old, some are more than that. What system are they going to be operating in that time frame? What should we expect around how they work? This requires a lot of one study, but then also again communication with people that have a stake in those. It's complicated.
Okay, so here's my last question to you, and then we're going to get into questions from the audience.
Great.
So do you think it'd be beneficial to have a new federal flood protection standard that required a higher margin of safety for siting and design for federally funded infrastructure projects?
I think it would be great. At the risk of unintentionally using a pun, but having to, it's often said that a rising tide lifts all the boats. So if we can bring, especially those ones that have the most lax standards up a little bit, then everybody will be a little bit better off. There are some guidelines. in place at the federal level, especially around some of the community development block grants from HUD that require some of their disaster recovery dollars to not just go build something back in a place where it's going to be super vulnerable again, of tending to avoid floodplains, or if it's got to be in a floodplain, it's critical infrastructure, putting it a couple feet above that. Similar thing for the Defense Authorization Act in 2019, 2018, and then in 2019, no, 19, and then this year already, some guidance for defense installations to do the similar things, not develop in a floodplain. It's got to be there, put it up. Interestingly, there actually was guidance via an executive order from a previous federal administration to really enact those on a much more rigorous basis. But the executive order was withdrawn 10 days before Hurricane Harvey hit. So there was an opportunity to rebuild a lot in a little bit more thoughtful way. Dollars are flowing and that's not necessarily happening. So I think we missed a big opportunity. And at the same time, I've also heard currently around how we think about the National Flood Insurance Program, that's got to change. Pricing in a real measure of risk has become more talked about. But one of the things that we saw, even at the state level, there's just a big difference. I know of a couple counties that are right next to each other in Texas even that have very different philosophical approaches to dealing with flood risk. And those conversations are going to be hard to have, but they're necessary.
Gotcha. So let's go ahead and go to the questions from the audience. So Daryl asks, let's see, can you talk a little bit about how much, if any, of the flood funding would be available for fundamental research around ecosystem resilience, and how somebody would go about applying for those funds?
Daryl, that one's near and dear to my heart. Maybe we should have a chat too. So there are some dollars, again, for study and design, which might overlap with some of what you're talking about. I think also opportunities are through the General Land Office. This particular one is probably not going to go really heavy in that direction, but honestly, the current dollars allocated towards projects are small. If you look at the state flood assessment, it talked about $31 billion to meet the state's flood needs in just the 10 years. That's the next 10 years. We got a couple billion, I'll call it a few billion out of state and federal authorizations combined. We're talking an order of magnitude short. So we need a lot more. I think there's an opportunity to do this. There are a couple outlets. And I think there are other local jurisdictions that are willing to maybe go in on some flood infrastructure fund approaches to study alongside of things that they're already doing. But I'd love to continue that conversation with you afterward, Ren.
All right. And so a question from Michael: how important is new reservoir development planning in mitigating flooding problems?
New reservoir? Is that what I heard?
Yes, I think he's talking about flood control reservoirs.
Sure. So there's a reason dams are where they are, is because that was the place that made sense to put them. So most of our good dam locations are already occupied. It's also becoming a lot harder to both permit and maybe acquire land for those. So I think traditional large reservoirs probably aren't going to be a super common approach. It's going to be really tricky to just make that happen. I think possibly in some areas, an opportunity for some small reservoirs. But I think, again, those have a limited lifetime. If you look at projections from the state water plan, a lot of those reservoirs are also filling up with sediment. So that means if they're losing capacity for water storage, for water supply, that also means that they're losing their capacity to store floodwaters for flood control. So there are probably some other ways, like non-structural approaches, that you could try first. And then even if you were to go towards a small reservoir, wrap that up in other thoughtful, non-structural and probably nature-based solutions as well, just to maximize. I don't think that there's any structural project that should stand on its own. I think everything should be wrapped up in other thoughtful non-structure and nature-based solutions. But the short answer is that I wouldn't expect to see a whole lot of new big flood control dams.
All right. Well, let's see. Jill asks, can you expand a bit on what you mean by nature-based solutions and how that might look different in urban and rural areas? And I'm a big proponent of land trusts. I think land trusts have a big role to play in that.
So I think you're exactly right. In terms of splitting it up between rural areas and urban areas, increasingly one of the biggest things that's happening in urban areas is buyouts. That means if a place has been repeatedly flooded, it doesn't make sense to put somebody in danger and continue to live there. Give them resources, let them move somewhere else, build a community that's resilient in an adjacent place or in another place, and then use that land to help you with your flood issues. And that could be things like restored wetlands. That could be things like setback levees in some places where that's necessary. I've heard even Representative or Chairman Dade Phelan say in Southeast Texas, he's a big fan of turning buyouts into old swamps, which is what a lot of the area used to be anyways. So I think that's a gigantic opportunity. If you look in rural areas or areas that are kind of on that interface between rural and urban, just like it's a lot cheaper to preserve open space before a house is built on it than it is to go back in and buy a house after the fact. I think preservation of critical areas, especially along floodplains and other places that provide a lot of water slowing capacity, hold it, that makes sense. If you can't preserve it, then maybe when a place is damaged, you can go back in and build conservation, nature-based projects where they were previously, or to augment what's already there. There's kind of three classes, is one, to restore what was lost, two, to do something new, to build something new, or three, preserve what you had in the first place. And those have different degrees of difficulty and funding for different reasons. But it makes the most sense to do the easiest thing that costs the least. And a lot of times that is preservation. So those can also provide huge benefits in terms of amenities to communities. Parks, trails through floodplains are hugely popular. It should not be lost. I think everybody loves those. I love them. I think that can also be a gigantic lift in terms of slowing down water, slowing down sediment, and making people safer.
So, and I would just add to that, I think that really there is a case to be made for larger projects as opposed to smaller projects, because a lot of small projects, the cost of monitoring goes up, and when you have a larger project, it's just, my experience has been, it's easier to, ensure success with it. But it's just my 2 cents.
I agree with that too. And Tana, I'd also kind of kick back that to collaborative and cooperative, is even if you might have a small project, if you recognize that there are a lot of small projects potentially together, you can capture efficiencies of scale there and still roll them up. So I think that there still are opportunities, but yes, thinking smart and not duplicating effort, you can do these lean and smart if you're thinking creatively.
So Mark asks, what document you cited during your discussion on natural resilience projects?
Oh, so that one was literally a website that offers a pretty awesome suite of options. It's just called Naturally Resilient Communities. It's got a great breakdown and helps you kind of play different scenarios of what your challenges are, what your geographic location is, again, how much maybe you have to spend relatively, and then offers up some non-structural and nature-based solutions that could either stand on their own or that could complement other more structural approaches that are going in. And this really is the way of the future. It's the way of now. And it really makes sense in terms of cost for the long run. Even the Army Corps of Engineers has their, what is it, living with nature? Engineering with nature program, where they really encourage all sorts of structural projects to have at least a non-structural nature-based element. And the recent story that I cited from the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, that's what they're doing up there. They're pushing back levees, using that to restore wetlands or to provide park space. Everybody's thinking about doing it, so there's a big opportunity to think smarter and cheaper.
So the last question that we've got from the audience is having to do with these slides from your presentation. I think we're going to try to put these on the Water Journal website, but would you like people to contact you directly as well? How would you like to handle that?
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's see, I'll go ahead. Do I have sharing? Am I still sharing? Is my screen on the?
Still sharing. There you go. Okay. Yep, there's your email.
Reach out to me there. And I kept this very high level. You can go into the weeds big time on the legislation, but then also how you think about how Texas should wrestle with these programs and beyond. There's a whole lot more that can be said around it.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt. Anything you want to say in wrapping up?
One thing to keep an eye out for is that regional flood planning process. Those regions were just very recently finalized, and I think there's going to be a call for stakeholders who are interested to play along. Play along. The state's going to need everybody who thinks thoughtfully to engage with this process. So whether that's formally sitting on the planning group or participating in meetings and providing input, do it. Absolutely.
Great. Well, hopefully in the not too distant future, but probably more distant than we like, we'll be able to get the Texas Water Symposium back together for our program on flooding, and we'll talk to you there.
I'd love to be there. Great.
Thanks again. And just a couple of closing remarks from the Water Journal. One is, so this is, of course, our first attempt at this. If you have any thoughts about what we might do to improve, what we're doing, please send those to me at todd@texaswaterjournal.org. And just a reminder that our next webinar is going to be May 13th at 10 a.m. with Gabriel Collins, and he's going to be talking about hydrovascular network for the Permian Basin and the Permian Basin watermark. So with that, we're done. And we're also going to try to figure out a way to have this presentation with not only the slides, but the narration posted on the Water Journal website at some point in the near future. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your week and weekend. Stay well also.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Todd.